Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours. I'm Shauna Robeson with Creating Space Coastal, and in this video, we're going to continue exploring the inking, stamping, and stenciling with discovering different backgrounds that you can make. You can use these to create backgrounds for greeting cards, or you can use them to create your own designer paper. So I'm going to just go through a bunch of different ways that you can use inks, stamps, and stencils to create fun designer paper or backgrounds for your greeting cards. So if you're interested in finding out how, stay tuned. Let's get started. They're solar white. Everything is the same. The finish is smooth. The difference between the two, according to the label, is one is 80 pounds and one is 110 pounds. That's just the weight. So it's going to be, this one's thicker than the 80 pound. The 80 pound is the one that I've used historically, and it's the one that I've liked the best, and I feel like just touching it, I feel like it has a smoother finish, and it looks like it has a smoother finish, but I haven't worked a lot with the 110, so I can't really speak if it functions a lot different yet, but the jury's still out on that. But I do really like the 80 pound. This one's a little thicker, so it's better maybe if you're making cards. It's a little stiffer, so that might be better for some projects or not. Now, today I did print off some of my sentiments on this 110, but the rest of the pages that I'm going to be doing the demos on is going to be on the 80. So just be aware of that. So hopefully that clarifies that confusion. Another thing, I'm going to be coming out with this on a PDF on my website, but I'm still adding things to it. But I will be adding a little cheat sheet that will have a lot of these techniques that I'm going to be demonstrating. And it has just a little like tips and suggestions around them and just basic instructions on how to do them. So if you were following along, you'd be able to, look at these techniques and be able to hopefully recreate them on your own. And you can always watch the video on YouTube along with it if you need to. But so I will be posting that, so stay tuned. I'm adding more and more. I keep thinking of more techniques and things that I want to share. So that's the reason I haven't published that yet. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is I did cut all my cardstock and everything down with this trimmer. I do recommend having a paper trimmer. I don't have one of the guillotine ones, which is the one that has the arm that comes down. I think those are really good and probably better than this type of trimmer, but I already had trimmers. I have more than one, and I didn't want to invest in that. But this one is nice because it's compact, and it does have a little swing arm that comes out, so I can use it for larger, my 12 by 12 pages if I want to. It has all these little guidelines. So this one works pretty well. I don't have any problems with it. They have rotator blades as well, which I think are really nice too. This one does tend to get dull a little quicker than some of like the rotator blades. But anyway, so I am using a cutter behind the scenes. I'm not going to be cutting things in front of you, but I did want to let you know that's one tool that I would recommend, just having some kind of paper cutter. I'm also going to be doing a lot of the techniques on top of this grid graph paper. I think it does help to have a grid. Sometimes cutting mats will have a grid, and that can be helpful. There's also this Misty tool, which I will be demonstrating at some point, and it has a grid as well, but I'm not going to be probably using that today. But anyway, so it is nice to have the grid to help with placement of things, but it's not necessary. You can eyeball a lot of things too. But I do like to have a piece of paper underneath me. Some people just use a mat, as a stamping mat or something. And I'll tell you the pros and cons. So having some kind of scratch paper underneath, first of all, you can stamp off and use it as scratch paper. Second of all, if it has grids on it, that's helpful. Third of all, what happens is when you're doing some of these techniques, some of the ink is going off the page. So if I were to, let's say I'm stamping only partially on, some of that ink that I loaded is going to go onto the table, or where I am, the surface that I'm working on. And if it goes on paper, it absorbs in the paper, and it's not going to necessarily smear onto my project. Now, if I'm working on a piece that I don't care what the back is like, and it gets into that ink and it smears, that's fine. But if I'm working on a finished piece where I don't want to get ink on my project, for example, let's say I was stamping directly on a finished card, right? And I'm stamping onto that. I don't want to accidentally move this onto ink and get it smeared on the back. So when you do it on paper, it just is a place that can hold the ink and help you keep your project a little cleaner. So you're not as likely to pick up ink and smear it either with your fingers or get other things in it, and that sort of thing. So that's the reason I'm working on paper. I've done both, and there's pros and cons. The pros for working on a rubber mat or a stamp mat is that you can use the ink that you get on there too. So you can use that kind of as a palette. And I still have a space for that. Like this is a rubber silicone mat that I can use. I just like to have the paper underneath my project to keep it from smearing. So that's the reason I have that long explanation, but I do think that it can be helpful. And you'll see artists do different things when you see them online for different reasons. But anyway, so that's that. Okay. So I'm going to basically be going through several basic techniques of stamping today. And to simplify, I'm going to be using a simple color palette of just a few colors. You can, of course, use any color schemes that you want for these. You can use any water-based. Mostly I'm going to be doing the water-based dye ink, and this is the distress ink that I'm primarily going to be using, and I'll let you know when I use something different. But this is designed for techniques, a lot of the techniques that I'm going to be doing. This is good for, now some of them, it might be better to use a different dye-based ink, and I'll explain that when I come along. But I just wanted to simplify it as much as possible. So these are my color scheme is basically some limes and some greens and teals. So that's what I'm going to be using. But again, choose your own thing. I do recommend if you're just trying things out for the first time, use analogous colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So if you're using reds, for example, you can use red, orange, yellows, things that are close together so that you don't get muddy colors when you mix them. So like I said, just pick your own colors, but I do suggest if you're new to color mixing and blending, you might want to just pick colors that are close together. All right, the first thing that I'm going to kind of start to basic and then kind of move up to more and more things to use and more complicated. And then I'll show you at the end what I will do with these. Now, any of these techniques that I'm showing, you can always use with an art journaling or mixed media project. You don't have to limit it to card making. I'm just using it in the context of card making just because that's where I started, and I might as well use these to create some cards. The thing that's cool about card making is they're smaller projects. You can finish them, and then you have something you can give to people for, you know, for holidays or birthdays or whatever. So, so I enjoy still card making, although I admit I make more cards than I send, I think, because I'm not good at mailing things. But okay, so the first technique I want to talk about is just basically taking your ink pads. Now, distress inks come in these minis, and then this is their normal size, and they're squares. And you can use either of them. I have a small project, so I'm using these minis. But you can do this with any of the ink pads. It doesn't even have to be the dye ink. And you're just going to basically go straight from the ink pad to the paper. And I'm going to be focusing on backgrounds today. So this is almost like creating your own designer paper or creating backgrounds that could be used either for, like I said, for art journaling or for cards. And then you would put the focal point on top of it. So you just take this cube, and I'm just going to randomly place it down on my page, kind of rotating it each time. And let's see, I'll just do one right in the middle. And I'm doing different pressures, different rotations, different orientations. I'm just making a background, so I want it real random. This is a lighter, kind of a lighter color anyway, or at least it's not as juicy as the other one, so it comes off a little bit lighter, even though it's a darker color. And this one's real dark, so This is my darkest color. And I can go over the top of the other ones. I always like to go off the page too. I think it just tells you the story that this is continuing on even beyond this page. And so I think there's just something that, you know, is nice about that. It just tells you that this is just a portion of the story, kind of. So I don't know, I just is more visually appealing. So here's a nice just stamped background, just using these cubes. Again, you could use the bigger cubes. You could use other types of stamp pads. Test it on a sampler. Like, for example, I would probably just do a sample. I'm just going to show you. Like, this is a pigment ink. It's rectangle. And I'm just going to see how it turns out. You can see the rectangle there. And that doesn't look too bad. You know, I could definitely use that. It does create these little tabs kind of on the sides, which I don't care for. So maybe if I go a little softer, it won't. Yeah, a little softer, it won't. So always test and see, you know, how it works. I'm going to try it with this one. See how that one works. That one doesn't really, it's either not real juicy enough or something, but it's not really working too well. I mean, it's not giving me a real clear rectangle. So just a suggestion to try it out on scratch paper before you put it on a project to see how it works. These almost look like little stamps. All right, the next one I want to show you is to use a brayer. Now, a brayer roller looks like this. You can also, I think they also call them craft rollers, but it's basically just rubber. They're sort of firm rubber. It's not foam, even though it looks similar to a foam roller. I finally got the medium size, and they come in different sizes. I have the large, and I don't know if they have them different than these three, but I have a small, medium, large. So depending on your project size, you can use it. And with this one, I'm going to need the bigger cubes because I have this bigger roller. So that's going to be tricky on those little cubes. So I'm just going to take these bigger ink pads, these three colors, and I'm just going to randomly roll the color. Now, since I'm going to be doing all three of these and using the same roller, I'm going to go from the lightest color to the darkest color. That way, if there's any pigment left on there, I'm not transferring the dark color to the light color. I don't mind getting them a little bit mixed up, to be honest, but I try to keep them as pure as possible. So I'm going to start with this lighter color. I'm just going to roll right on top of the ink pad. And then I'm going to randomly just roll it right on my paper. And you can see each time I roll it, it becomes less and less, and it creates some interesting patterns. Now I can try to rinse this off a little bit by just running it on my fiber just to get any extras off, or I can run it here just to get kind of work off that extra. And then I go to the next color, load it up, and I'm just going different directions, trying not to do the same pattern. Now you could do this with one color and just really load up this whole page and just make it a colored cardstock if you wanted to. Now that's my darkest color. So I have just an interesting, background pattern. And like I said, if I wanted to, I could say, okay, I want a matting for some, for my card base, I want some matting behind something, and I want a certain color that I don't have the paper of. So what I could do is I could just really load this up, work those edges. And make a pretty solid cardstock. Now I could do that also with the brushes, and I'll show you that later. But now if I were to put something on top of it, let's say I wanted this to be the backdrop of this, it's almost like you have cardstock that's already that color, and this one has a little bit of texture to it. You could make it more solid if you just keep adding more and more ink. But I like that kind of marbled look. So see, you could just use that as your matting, and you don't have to have then every color of the rainbow for your cardstock. You can just have white and then use your inks. So that's one way to do that. So the first way you can do this, use the blending, is to just do kind of a random pattern. I like to start from the lightest to the darkest because I'm using the same tool. And once I put the dark on, it's just, it's going to mask some of the color of the lighter one. So I always start from light to dark. So I'm just going to tap and massage my brush onto the pad. And then I always start from the outside and work in. The reason I do that is because when you first set it down, if it's loaded and has lots of juicy pigment, sometimes it can create blotchiness on your project. Let me just, I'll do it on the project and see if it shows that. But sometimes when you first lay it down, it didn't do too bad. The brush seems to do better than the dauber, but I can see a little bit of texture there. Let me bring this a little bit closer. Just sometimes because you have so much, especially if it's a juicy inker, you might just have more on it than you really want to put down. So if you start over here, you can kind of put a little bit down there and you see how concentrated it is, and then you can move to your project and you have a little bit more control. But it's just a really soft background, and I could stamp another stamp focal point right on top of that, or else I could just use that as matting. There's lots of things that I could do with that. So that's a way to just make some interesting background paper. All right, and then you can also do kind of a layered effect. Hello, everyone. Just a reminder to please like, subscribe, share, and comment if you find this content helpful. Let's get back to the program. So this time I'm just going to do it kind of like rainbow. So this is great for if you're doing a sunset or something like that where there's a gradient of color. The next way you can use the blending technique, of course, is with stencil. And they make a variety of stencils, of course, and this is a nice background stencil because it's just a reoccurring pattern that's just real, it's real, almost like a wallpaper pattern. So it's a great pattern to use for a background stencil. It's a good idea to try to, in this case, make sure that your card isn't going to be moving. So it'd be nice to be able to tape it down, but because I'm basically covering the whole card, I can't really do that because if I tape anywhere, it's going to basically create a mask for that area that I tape. So what I just do is I just make sure it's not slipping around. This paper kind of acts like a little bit of a skid plate or a non-skid plate, I guess. Doesn't slide a lot on there. And then I just put it in the orientation that I want. And then I just keep my finger down in the areas that I'm not working on. So it can be a little bit tricky, and but it works okay. I put my finger where it's touching not only the stencil, but also the paper underneath, so the paper doesn't move. My finger acts as like a little brake. And then I can go ahead and stencil on there. And then you get a nice cool background pattern. So if you think about designer paper, like if you're going to be doing some layering with, what's the word? Oh my gosh, I'm having a brain moment. Okay, the word I was looking for when I was talking about this is collage. For collage paper. So you could just do these kinds of things on the back of junk mail. I mean, it can just be on regular paper, and then you can tear those up and create collages with all of these background designs. The next way you can use the stenciling is to create a pattern paper that's more specific, like rather than, I mean, it can still be a background, but you can design it yourself. So I have this stencil that has all of these fun little sea creatures, and you can either pick and choose what you want on this stencil, and I'm going to just show you how to do that. I'm not going to create this one because it does take a little bit longer, but if you want to do that, pick and choose, you just choose whatever critter that you want. Okay, let's say I want to do this little sea turtle. So anyway, okay, so you find the design that you want, and you'll notice with this particular stencil, these guys are all really close together. So if I just wanted to use this one, it might be a little bit tricky. So one way to handle that is to mask off the surrounding areas. And I just use this paper tape. This is kind of a surgical tape. And the cool thing about the inks is they're a little drier than paint and things like that. So this works just fine, this paper tape. And you just basically block off the areas around it that you don't want to get ink on them, because what'll happen when you're trying to do that is you'll get some of the surrounding areas, and then you'll get something where you don't want it. So a way to avoid that is just mask it all off. And it also kind of sticks it to the page anyway, and then you can go ahead and do that one particular item that you want. The easier way, of course, to do that, to use this one, would be just to use it as is, and you just lay it down in an orientation that works for you, and you can create the whole thing at one time. So I did both. I did both of those, and it creates two different types, two different effects. So this one I can be really specific about what I want, and this one is just using the design that they have. And then I also did another example where I did the background like I did before with the brush technique, and then I used a black pigment ink over the top of it. So the back is kind of that sort of not tie-dye, but just, you know, soft multicolor, and then I did the black over. The next thing to do is just stamping. And the distress inks aren't the best for design stamping because it's more designed for these techniques, so it doesn't give as clean of a stamp. And I'm going to just show you an example. But there are background stamps that they're larger. Let me back this up a little bit. They're larger in size. They're designed to be background, and there's usually just they're just a kind of a simple pattern like that that's great for background. But it's a little tricky because this is soft and big, and I could put it on an acrylic block. I do have a block that's bigger like this, but trying to push that onto a project is challenging. So what you can do with these bigger ones is just set it down on the table with the pattern up, and then you can ink up pattern with the pad this way. So you don't always have to stamp the pattern into the ink. You can do the ink onto the pattern. I'm going to actually use my bigger. This one's a little juicier. So you can load up your stamp this way. And you'll notice that even though this is the rubber stamp, see how it's kind of balling up a little bit. And that's just I think that has to do with the formula of this particular ink. I think if I was using a different ink, it would be different. But I'm gonna show you an example. And then I'm going to lay down, being careful not to move it once it's down, but I'm just going to set this down, making sure it's in the middle of the stamp. And now I can use my fingers to run around that, but then I'm going to get that ink all over my fingers. So instead, what I'm going to do is just take a piece of, oh, see, that's not my, just a piece of printer paper and lay it down over the top of that. And then I can rub it with my fingers all the way around and around the edges. And all of that ink that's around the edges of that will get on this paper and not on my fingers. Because once you get it on your fingers, it ends up on your project somewhere where you least expect it. So just make sure that if you do get some on your fingers, clean it off. You can also, at this point, if you prefer, you could use a brayer. Now you'll notice again, like I was talking about, that you get these little beaded. Now I don't mind that look. I think that looks really cool, having all those little kind of, it looks very rustic. It looks distressed, hence the word distressing. But I'm going to just show you, I'm going to try it with a different kind of ink and just see if that gives us a little bit of a better non-distressed type look. Because if I was trying to get a cleaner look, I might not want it to do that. This is the Stampin' Up! Tempting Turquoise. Now look at how juicy that is. See how quickly that just loads on that stamp. There's no beading, there's nothing. It's really, really thick and juicy on there. And already it looks like it's going to be a better. I'm still seeing a little bit of that. I'm still seeing some of that pattern there. That's interesting. Because it looked a lot cleaner, but it's still giving me some of that. Okay, now I'm going to try it with the pigment ink and see how that looks. Notice I'm just trying to carefully lift it up. It still has a little bit of it's cleaner than the other one, but there's still some mottled look to it. So it might just be this rubber. Maybe there's actually a texture on the stamp that I didn't realize. It's cleaner than the other, but it still has just a little bit of a mottled look. But I'm starting to think now that I'm looking at this that there's a little bit of some texture that's built into the stamp that I just didn't notice. You know, like a little, it's designed to have a bit of a distressed look. Okay, so that is the pigment ink. This one, definitely you can see there's just a lot more light. It's just not as strong of coverage compared to these two. These two have strong coverage and they both have that mottled look, but I think actually this one has less than this now that I look at it side by side. But I'm just wondering if that rubber has a little bit of texture to create that. But I like the look of it. I think it looks really cool with that sort of mottled look. All right. So background stamp. Now you can also use other types of stamps to create a background, even if they're not a background stamp. Now you could either make the background a color. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to create just a green background. this works best with just small design elements. So you could do it with leaves, or in my case, I'm using from this stamp. So this is by the Tide Stampin' Up. And I don't know, this could be retired by now, but I'm using these just some small elements to create the background. And I'm just going to basically stamp them different directions, but I want something small. Now, one effect that you can do is if you've already stamped it once, you could stamp it a second time and get a lighter and lighter. It's called ghosting or echo. I call it echo effect. So there you go. I have this now. It just looks like pattern designer paper, and I can make it any theme that I want. So you don't have to have all the fancy schmancy, and I can do it. I could do this just right on, like I said, some recycling that I have, because oftentimes the stuff that they send you in the mail is thicker, good quality printer paper. So you could just create these effects and use that as designer paper for your collages. Now, let me just talk about the sentiment. I did not have a stamp that said what I liked to do. So if you have a stamp, great. You could stamp it on a piece of cardstock. This cardstock is that heavier one, and I ended up printing this. So what I did is I created a Word document with a table, and then I put a bunch of like quotes in there that are related to the ocean. And this one I thought of. I searched online for little quotes and things like that, or little sentiments, but this was something that popped into my head. Salty hair, sandy toes, at the beach, anything goes. And I just changed up some of the font and, bolded or, made something bigger or smaller. So just make it interesting just by changing a little bit of the font, and it'll look like a stamp, basically. I took just straight from the stamp pad, because these are the distressing, so these are designed for this kind of thing. And it has kind of a linen pad, and so it creates these interesting textures, like the little fibers of the linen create some different textures around the bottom. So I just basically you just make some, and it just finishes it off. Just gives it a more finished look. You can do that for all of these as well. You could basically just edge them, give them a little bit of a finished look, either by doing this, or you could even, brush in the edges a little bit. And see how much more finished that looks than this one. Just gives it a little bit of like polished look. Here are some examples of what I did to finish off those cards. I will be showing more of these techniques in the future videos, but I just wanted to show you with these backgrounds what I was able to pull together just by adding some embellishments, a stamp here and there, fussy cut. You get a variety of cards from using those backgrounds. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you find this content helpful. And as always, happy creating. Bye.